The night of September 15, 1994, wrought one of the worst hurricanes Florida had ever seen. Dark clouds rolled across the sky like angry waves, and the wind howled through the streets of Tampa Bay with a fury that made even the bravest souls tremble. Rain pounded against windows and roofs, creating a constant drumming that would haunt residents' memories for years to come. Michael Reeves, a 32-year-old firefighter with the Tampa Bay Fire Department, had just started his night shift when the emergency calls began flooding in. With 12 years of experience under his belt, Michael had seen his fair share of disasters, but something about this night felt different. His weathered face showed concern as he watched the rain through the station's window, his cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. At exactly 11:43 p.m., the emergency alarm blared through the station. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the speaker, reporting a critical situation at the Palm Grove Apartments on Ocean Drive. A single mother and her twin babies were trapped on the third floor, with water rapidly rising around the building. "This is going to be a tough one," Michael muttered to his colleague, Dave, as they rushed to their gear. The weight of his equipment felt familiar as he suited up, each movement practiced and precise. The red emergency lights of their truck cut through the darkness and rain as they sped toward the apartment complex. When they arrived, the scene was chaos. The hurricane had transformed the peaceful suburban street into something out of a nightmare. Cars floated like toys in the rising water, and debris from damaged buildings scattered across the flooded roads. The three-story apartment building stood precariously, its lower level already submerged in murky water. A small crowd of evacuated residents huddled under the protection of a nearby shopping center's awning. Among them was Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who immediately approached the firefighters, her voice shaking with urgency. "Lisa Connor and her babies are still up there," she cried, pointing to a window on the third floor. "She called me just minutes ago. The water's coming into her apartment, and she can't get out." Michael's training kicked in as he assessed the situation. The main entrance was completely underwater, and the fire escape on the building's side looked dangerously unstable. Time was running out. The structure wouldn't hold much longer against the hurricane's assault. "I'm going in," Michael announced to his team captain. "The back stairwell might still be accessible." Despite protests about the danger, Michael knew he had to act fast. With a waterproof radio secured to his uniform and a rescue rope tied around his waist, he began wading through the chest-deep water toward the building's rear entrance. The current was strong, trying to sweep his feet out from under him with every step. Inside the building, the situation was even worse. The stairwell was dark, illuminated only by Michael's flashlight. Water cascaded down the steps like a waterfall, making each step treacherous. The building groaned around him, its structure stressed by the storm's relentless beating. As he reached the second floor, Michael heard the distinct sound of babies crying above him. The noise gave him renewed energy as he pushed forward, fighting against the water that now reached his waist even on the stairs. Finally, on the third floor, he found apartment 3C. The door was jammed, swollen from the water seeping through the building. Michael could hear Lisa Connor's voice inside, trying to soothe her crying infants. "Fire department," he shouted, pounding on the door. "Stand back, I'm coming in." With 3 powerful kicks, the door burst open. Inside, he found Lisa standing on her couch, holding her twin babies close to her chest. Water had begun seeping into the apartment, covering the floor in several inches of water. The babies, barely 3 months old, were wrapped in blankets, their tiny faces red from crying. Lisa's eyes filled with tears of relief when she saw Michael. "Oh, thank God," she whispered, her voice trembling. Michael quickly assessed the situation, knowing they had precious little time. The building shuddered ominously, and through the window he could see the storm's intensity increasing. This was just the beginning of what would become one of the most dramatic rescues of his career, one that would connect him to these people in ways he could never imagine, even 30 years later. The real challenge was about to begin, and Michael knew that getting all 3 of them out safely would require everything he had learned in his years as a firefighter, and perhaps a bit of divine intervention as well. Michael knew he had only minutes to act. The building's groaning had grown louder, and chunks of ceiling plaster were falling around them. Lisa Connor stood trembling on her couch, clutching her twin babies who had momentarily stopped crying, perhaps sensing the gravity of their situation. "We need to move fast," Michael said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. The building won't hold much longer. He reached for his radio to update his team, but only static came through. The storm had knocked out their communications. The twins, a boy and a girl, were wrapped in blue and pink blankets. Michael quickly assessed their best escape route. The main stairwell he'd come up was now completely flooded, and the fire escape looked ready to tear away from the building at any moment. Their only option was the service stairs at the far end of the hallway. "I'll have to take them one at a time," Michael explained to Lisa, who immediately tightened her grip on her babies. "Trust me, it's the only way." A loud crack echoed through the building, making them all jump. Water was now pouring in faster through the apartment's windows, and the floor beneath them shifted unnaturally. Lisa looked at her babies, tears streaming down her face, then nodded at Michael. "Take James first," she said, holding out her son. "He's smaller." Michael carefully took the baby boy, securing him inside his firefighter jacket using a special infant rescue harness he always carried. Little James barely stirred, somehow remaining calm despite the chaos around them. The journey through the dark hallway was treacherous. The floor tiles were loose, and water sprayed in through broken windows. Michael moved carefully but quickly, knowing every second counted. He could hear parts of the building collapsing behind him. The service stairs were in better condition than the main stairwell, but still dangerous. Michael had to step carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. Halfway down, a section of stairs crumbled just after he crossed it, leaving a gaping hole behind him. There would be no going back that way. When he finally reached the ground floor, his team was waiting with a rescue boat. He handed James to the paramedics, who immediately checked the baby's vital signs. "He's perfectly fine," one of them announced, and Michael allowed himself a brief moment of relief before turning back toward the building. Getting back up to the third floor required finding a new route. The hole in the stairs forced him to climb up the outside of the stairwell, using pipes and window ledges as handholds. The hurricane-force winds threatened to tear him from the building with every movement. When he finally reached Lisa's apartment again, the situation had deteriorated significantly. Water was now knee-deep in the apartment, and Lisa stood on a floating table, holding her daughter Sarah tightly. "The couch tipped over," she explained, her voice shaking. "The table was all I could find." Michael didn't waste time. He took baby Sarah, securing her just as he had done with James. But as they prepared to leave, a deafening crack split the air. The building was starting to collapse. "We have to go now," Michael shouted over the noise. He grabbed Lisa's hand, and they rushed toward the door. The hallway floor was buckling beneath their feet, and walls were starting to cave in around them. They couldn't use the service stairs anymore. That section of the building was already gone. Michael made a split-second decision to risk the fire escape despite its questionable stability. It was their only chance. With Sarah secured against his chest and Lisa following close behind, Michael pushed open the fire escape door. The metal platform swayed dangerously in the wind, and the rain made everything slippery. They would have to move fast before the whole structure gave way. As they began their descent, Michael could feel the fire escape pulling away from the building. Every step caused the metal to groan and shift. They were 3 stories up, and the floodwaters below looked dark and menacing. If they fell, the chances of survival would be slim. The real test of Michael's courage and skill was about to begin, with 2 lives depending entirely on his next decisions. The fire escape swayed dangerously as Michael and Lisa made their way down. Baby Sarah remained remarkably quiet inside Michael's protective jacket, as if understanding the need for complete concentration. The wind whipped around them with such force that they had to stop every few steps to maintain their balance. Halfway down, the entire structure jerked violently. Michael heard the horrifying sound of metal bolts snapping above them. Looking up, he saw the top section of the fire escape tear away from the building, bringing chunks of brick with it as it crashed into the floodwaters below. "Don't look down," Michael shouted to Lisa over the howling wind. "Just keep moving." They were on the second-floor landing when Michael heard another ominous crack. The remaining section of the fire escape was starting to pull away from the wall. They'd had seconds, maybe less, before the whole thing would collapse. Making a split-second decision, Michael turned to Lisa. "Do you trust me?" he asked. She nodded without hesitation, her eyes wide with fear, but filled with determination. "When I count to 3, we're going to jump toward that tree," he said, pointing to a large oak tree whose branches extended close to the fire escape. "It's our only chance." Lisa looked at the tree, then at her baby secured safely against Michael's chest, and nodded again. The fire escape groaned beneath them, beginning to tilt away from the building. 1. Michael positioned himself to protect both Lisa and Sarah. 2. He grabbed Lisa's hand tightly. 3. They leaped just as the fire escape gave way completely. For a terrifying moment, they were airborne, the wind and rain pelting their faces. Michael's firefighting training kicked in as he twisted his body to protect Sarah while keeping his grip on Lisa's hand. They crashed through the tree's branches, the thick foliage helping to break their fall. Michael managed to grab onto a sturdy branch with his free hand while still holding Lisa. They hung there for a moment, the ground still 8 feet below them, but now they were safe from the collapsing building. "Let go," Michael called to Lisa. "My team is right below with rescue equipment." Lisa released her grip and fell into the waiting rescue net his fellow firefighters had positioned beneath the tree. Seconds later, Michael followed, carefully cradling Sarah against his chest as he dropped. As soon as they hit the ground, paramedics rushed forward. They quickly checked Sarah, who was completely unharmed, protected by Michael's careful positioning during their escape. The baby girl was quickly reunited with her brother James in the nearby ambulance, both twins remarkably calm despite the chaos they'd just survived. Lisa stood in the rain, watching as her apartment building continued to crumble. The entire 3rd floor collapsed just minutes after their escape, sending a shower of debris into the floodwaters. She turned to Michael, who was removing his helmet and catching his breath. "You saved us," she said simply, her voice full of emotion. "You saved my babies." Michael just nodded, too exhausted for words. His uniform was soaked and torn from their journey through the tree, and cuts and scratches covered his face and hands. But his eyes showed the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. News cameras had arrived during the rescue, and reporters were already gathering around, eager to interview the heroic firefighter. But Michael waved them away, instead focusing on making sure Lisa and the twins were properly cared for. "They need to get to the hospital for a checkup," he insisted, helping Lisa into the ambulance with her babies. "That's what's important right now." As the ambulance pulled away, Michael's captain approached him. "That was something else, Reeves," he said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You'll be getting a commendation for this one." But Michael shook his head. "Just doing my job, Cap. Those babies needed help, and I was there to give it." What Michael didn't know then was that this rescue would create a connection that would span decades, leading to an incredible reunion 30 years later. But for now, he simply watched the ambulance disappear into the rainy night, carrying the family he'd just saved to safety, before turning to help with the other emergencies that still needed attention during that terrible storm. The years following the dramatic rescue passed quickly. Lisa Connor and her twins, James and Sarah, moved into a small apartment across town, rebuilding their lives after losing everything in the hurricane. The story of their rescue made local headlines for a few days, but soon faded from public memory, as most news stories do. The twins grew up hearing the story of the brave firefighter who saved them as babies. Lisa kept a wrinkled newspaper clipping from that day, though the photo was too grainy to make out Michael Reeves' face clearly. She would often tell them the story at bedtime, describing how he carried them one by one through the storm, and then saved her life with a daring jump into a tree. "Your guardian angel," she would call him, though she never managed to find him again to properly thank him. Michael had politely declined interviews and attention after the rescue, and in the chaos of rebuilding their lives, Lisa's attempts to locate him had proven unsuccessful. As children, Sarah and James were inseparable, sharing the special bond that only twins can understand. Sarah was the more serious of the two, always with her nose in a medical book, fascinated by how the human body worked. James was the creative one, constantly building elaborate structures with his blocks and Legos, dreaming of designing buildings that could withstand any storm. Their mother worked 2 jobs to support them, determined to give her children the best education possible. Despite the challenges, Lisa managed to create a warm and loving home. The twins excelled in school, driven by their mother's dedication and their own determination to make her proud. But life had other plans for the Connor family. When the twins were 16, Lisa was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. Despite fighting bravely for 2 years, she passed away just before their high school graduation. Her last words to them were about staying strong and following their dreams, just as they had survived that terrible night as babies. After their mother's death, the twins' paths began to diverge. Sarah, driven by her mother's illness and their miracle survival as infants, pursued medical school at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Her goal was to become an emergency room doctor, wanting to save others the way they had been saved. James headed west to study architecture at the University of Chicago. The memory of that hurricane-damaged building had left an indelible mark on him, inspiring him to design structures that could protect people from nature's fury. He developed innovative approaches to disaster-resistant architecture, slowly building a reputation in his field. Through college and their early careers, the twins remained close despite the physical distance between them. They spoke weekly by phone, sharing their challenges and achievements. Sarah told James about her grueling residency and the lives she helped save in the ER. James shared stories about his revolutionary building designs and the projects he was working on. Yet both felt a lingering connection to Tampa Bay and the mysterious firefighter who had saved their lives. Every year on the anniversary of their rescue, they would call each other and wonder about him. Where was he now? Did he ever think about them? Did he know what had become of the tiny babies he carried through that storm? They tried searching for him occasionally, but firefighter records from that time weren't digitized, and the last name Reeves provided too many false leads. Their mother's old newspaper clipping had deteriorated over time, and the photo was now too faded to be useful. As they approached their 30th year, Sarah had become a respected emergency room doctor in Tampa Bay, having returned to her hometown after completing her residency. James had established himself as a leading architect in Chicago, specializing in hurricane-resistant buildings for coastal areas. Neither of them could have predicted that fate was about to bring their story full circle. The mysterious firefighter who had saved their lives was about to re-enter their world in a way that would prove that sometimes the most incredible coincidences are simply destiny in disguise. Their lives were about to intersect again, proving that even after 30 years, some connections never truly fade away. It was a busy Tuesday night in Tampa General Hospital's emergency room when the ambulance sirens wailed outside. Dr. Sarah Connor, now 30 years old, was just finishing her charts when the EMTs rushed in with an elderly man on a stretcher. 72-year-old male, possible heart attack, the paramedic reported quickly. Patient was found collapsed at his grandson's baseball game. Name's Michael Reeves. Sarah's hand froze over her paperwork. The name triggered something in her memory, but she pushed the thought aside. There must be many Michael Reeves in Tampa. She focused on her patient, who was conscious but in clear distress. "Mr. Reeves, I'm Dr. Connor," she said, beginning her examination. "Can you tell me what happened?" The older man's face was pale, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "Watching my grandson pitch," he managed between labored breaths. "Then this crushing pain in my chest. Been a firefighter for 30 years. Should have recognized the signs sooner." Sarah worked efficiently, ordering tests and medication while keeping her patient talking. There was something familiar about his face, something she couldn't quite place. As she checked his vital signs, she noticed old burn scars on his hands, the kind that came from years of firefighting. "You said you were a firefighter?" she asked, trying to keep him engaged while the medications began to work. "Here in Tampa?" Michael nodded, his breathing easier now as the treatment took effect. "Retired 5 years ago. Spent my whole career here. Best job in the world, even with all its challenges." "Any memorable rescues?" Sarah asked, not sure why she felt compelled to know more. A small smile crossed Michael's face. Too many to count, but there was this one night during the big hurricane of '94. Had to save these twin babies and their mother from a collapsing apartment building. Never forgot those little ones. Sometimes still wonder what happened to them. Sarah's hands began to tremble slightly as she checked his IV line. "The Palm Grove Apartments?" she asked quietly. Michael's eyes widened. "Yes, how did you know?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Because I was one of those babies. I'm Sarah Connor." The monitor tracking Michael's heart rate showed a small jump. He stared at her, really looking at her face for the first time. "Little Sarah?" The girl in the pink blanket. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she nodded. "My brother James and I, we grew up hearing about you. Our mother called you our guardian angel. We tried to find you over the years, but never could." Michael reached out and took her hand, his own eyes misting over. "I followed your stories in the local paper when I could. Saw when you graduated high school, Read about your mother's passing. I'm so sorry about that. Even saw when you got into medical school. Never wanted to intrude, but I always hoped you both were doing well." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of them. The man who had once saved her life was now her patient. Sarah quickly checked his latest test results, her doctor's instincts taking over despite her emotional discovery. "Well, Mr. Reeves, it looks like I get to return the favor," she said, reviewing his charts. "You're having a mild heart attack, but we caught it in time. You're going to need to stay in the hospital for a few days, but with proper treatment, you should make a full recovery." Michael squeezed her hand. "Just Michael, please. And your brother James? How is he?" Sarah smiled, pulling out her phone. "He's fantastic. He's an architect in Chicago now, designing buildings to withstand hurricanes, if you can believe it. I need to call him right away. He's not going to believe this." As Sarah prepared to contact her brother, she knew this wasn't just a coincidence. 30 years after that stormy night, fate had brought them full circle. But this time, she was the one doing the saving, and a new chapter of their intertwined story was about to begin. James Connor was in the middle of a project meeting in Chicago when his phone buzzed with his sister's call. He rarely answered calls during meetings, but something told him this one was important. Excusing himself, he stepped into the hallway of his architectural firm. "Sarah, is everything okay?" he asked, hearing the emotion in his sister's voice. "James, you need to sit down for this," Sarah said, her voice trembling with excitement. "Remember how we always wondered about the firefighter who saved us? I found him. Or rather, he found me. He's here in my ER." James leaned against the wall, his legs suddenly weak. "What? How?" Sarah quickly explained the situation with Michael's heart attack and their remarkable discovery. Without hesitation, James said, "I'm booking the next flight to Tampa." Within 4 hours, James was on a plane, his mind racing with thoughts of the man who had saved his life 30 years ago. He brought along their mother's old, faded newspaper clipping, kept safely in his wallet all these years. At Tampa General Hospital, Michael was recovering well, moved to a private room where Sarah checked on him frequently between her other patients. When James arrived that evening, still carrying his travel bag, Sarah was waiting in the lobby. The twins hugged tightly, both feeling the weight of this moment. "Ready to meet him?" Sarah asked. James nodded, unable to find words. They walked to Michael's room together. Despite being a successful architect who regularly presented to large audiences, James felt his heart pounding as they approached the door. Michael was sitting up in bed, looking much better than when he first arrived. His face lit up when he saw both twins enter the room. "James," he said softly, "look at you. All grown up." James stood there for a moment, taking in the sight of the man who had carried him through that hurricane 3 decades ago. Then, without warning, he crossed the room and hugged Michael carefully, mindful of the medical equipment. "Thank you," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We've waited so long to say that." Michael patted James' back, his own eyes glistening. "Seeing you both now, successful and healthy, that's all the thanks I ever needed." They spent the next few hours talking, sharing stories from both sides of that fateful night. Michael told them details they'd never known, how he'd actually burned his hands breaking down their apartment door, how he'd been terrified the entire time but couldn't show it, how he'd kept the small commendation medal he received in a box at home. James and Sarah shared their own stories. Growing up with their mother's tales of that night, their different paths in life inspired by the rescue, their unsuccessful attempts to find Michael over the years. They showed him the old newspaper clipping, and Michael smiled at the faded image of his younger self. "Your mother," Michael said softly, "she was so brave that night. The way she trusted me with you both, her most precious treasures. I've never forgotten her courage." "She never forgot your bravery either," Sarah replied, wiping away tears. "She told us that story so many times, wanting to make sure we knew about the man who gave us a chance at life." As evening approached, Michael's grandson Tommy arrived with Michael's daughter Claire. When they heard the full story of how Michael had saved the twins, and how Sarah was now treating him, Claire burst into tears. "Dad never told us the details of that rescue," she said. "He never talked much about any of his rescues. He always said he was just doing his job." The room fell into a comfortable silence as they all absorbed the magnitude of this reunion. 30 years had passed, but the connection forged that stormy night had somehow remained. waiting for the right moment to bring them all together again. As James and Sarah prepared to leave for the night, promising to return the next day, none of them could have predicted how this reunion would lead to yet another extraordinary chapter in their intertwined lives. 3 days after their emotional reunion, Michael was recovering well, but a routine follow-up scan revealed concerning news about his grandson Tommy. The 12-year-old boy had been complaining of chest pain similar to his grandfather's, and tests showed he had a rare congenital heart condition that would require specialized surgery. Claire, Michael's daughter, was devastated by the news. The procedure Tommy needed was complex, and only a handful of surgeons in the country were qualified to perform it. Even worse, the waiting lists were long, and Tommy's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Sarah sat with the family as they received the news, her medical training helping her understand the gravity of the situation. After the doctor left, she noticed Michael looking particularly worried. "The surgery," he said quietly, "even if we get it scheduled, our insurance won't cover most of it, and the best surgeon for this is at the Newman Heart Center in Chicago." James, who had extended his stay in Tampa to be with Michael, looked up suddenly. "The Newman Heart Center? The new one that just opened?" Claire nodded sadly. "Yes, but they're not accepting new patients for at least 6 months." A slow smile spread across James's face. "I designed that building," he said. "In fact, I've been working with them for the past year on their new wing." Sarah's eyes lit up as she made the connection. "Dr. Catherine Chen," she said. "She was my mentor during my residency before she moved to Chicago. She's now the head surgeon at Newman." Michael and Claire looked between the twins, hardly daring to hope. James was already pulling out his phone, letting me make a few calls. Within hours, things began moving quickly. James contacted the Newman Center's board, with whom he had developed a close relationship during the building's construction. Sarah reached out to Dr. Chen, explaining the incredible circumstances that had brought them all together. "The man who saved my life as a baby needs our help to save his grandson," Sarah explained to Dr. Chen. "Please, Catherine, if there's anything you can do." Dr. Chen, moved by the story and respecting Sarah's medical judgment, agreed to review Tommy's case. After examining his records, she confirmed she could perform the surgery, and due to the urgency of his condition, would make room in her schedule for the following week. But there was still the matter of the cost. That's when James stepped in again. "The Newman Center has a special fund for extraordinary cases," he explained. "As one of the architects who worked pro bono on their children's wing, I have some influence with the board. They've agreed to cover most of the expenses." Michael protested, feeling overwhelmed by their help, but Sarah took his hand. "30 years ago, you risked your life to save 2 babies you didn't know. Please, let those babies, now grown, help save your grandson." Claire burst into tears of relief, hugging both James and Sarah. Tommy, who had been quietly listening to everything, looked at the twins with wonder. "So if Grandpa hadn't saved you that night, you wouldn't be here to help me now?" "That's right," James replied, ruffling the boy's hair. "Sometimes life has a way of coming full circle." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. As soon as Michael was cleared to travel, arrangements were made to transfer Tommy to Chicago. James offered his apartment for the family to stay in, while he worked with the hospital to expedite all the necessary paperwork. Sarah took a week's leave from the ER to accompany them to Chicago, wanting to be there both as a doctor and as family, because that's what they had become. As they prepared for the journey, she noticed Michael standing by the hospital window, looking thoughtful. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Michael turned to her, his eyes misty. 30 years ago, I carried you and your brother through a hurricane, never knowing how that one night would change all our lives. And now here you both are, carrying us through another storm." Sarah hugged him gently, understanding that sometimes the most powerful forces in life aren't the hurricanes that tear things apart, but the connections that bring people together in ways they could never imagine. The morning of Tommy's surgery dawned bright and clear in Chicago. The Newman Heart Center stood impressive and tall against the skyline, a building James had designed with large, calming windows and peaceful gardens meant to give hope to worried families. Dr. Catherine Chen met with them early that morning. She exuded confidence as she explained the procedure to Michael, Claire, and Tommy, while Sarah and James stood supportively nearby. Tommy, brave like his grandfather, managed to smile despite his fear. "You know," Dr. Chen said to Tommy, Your Aunt Sarah was one of my best students, and this amazing building we're in, your Uncle James designed it specifically to help people like you heal better. She winked at the boy. You have quite a remarkable family looking out for you. As they prepared Tommy for surgery, Michael held his grandson's hand tightly. You're stronger than any heart condition, buddy, he whispered. And when you wake up, I'll tell you more stories about the night I saved your aunt and uncle. The surgery was expected to take 6 hours. Claire paced the waiting room while Michael sat quietly, his own recently treated heart aching with worry for his grandson. James and Sarah stayed with them, providing comfort and medical explanations when needed. During the 4th hour, Sarah received an unexpected call from Tampa. Her ER colleagues had learned about the situation, and the entire staff had gathered to send their prayers and support. The story of Michael saving the twins, and now the twins helping save his grandson, had spread through the hospital, touching everyone who heard it. Finally, Dr. Chen emerged from the operating room, still in her surgical scrubs, wearing a broad smile. The surgery was a complete success, she announced. Tommy did beautifully. His heart is already beating stronger than before. The room erupted in joy. Claire collapsed into Michael's arms, both of them crying happy tears. James and Sarah hugged each other, feeling the weight of the past month lift from their shoulders. Over the next few days, Tommy's recovery amazed everyone. The innovative design of the hospital room, with its large windows and soothing atmosphere, seemed to help speed his healing. Sarah worked with the medical team, her presence bringing extra comfort to both Tommy and his family. Local news stations picked up the story, captivated by its extraordinary circumstances. They called it the perfect circle of life. How a firefighter's bravery 30 years ago had saved 2 babies, who grew up to help save his grandson through their respective careers in medicine and architecture. A week after the surgery, as Tommy was preparing to be discharged, Michael gathered everyone in the room. I have something to say, he announced, his voice thick with emotion. 30 years ago, I thought I was just doing my job, saving 2 babies from a hurricane. I never imagined those babies would grow up to save my grandson. Sarah, James, you've given us a gift we can never repay. You already did, James replied, putting his arm around his sister. You gave us the chance to live, to become who we are today. Everything else is just us passing that gift forward. Sarah nodded, adding, and now Tommy has his whole life ahead of him, just like we did after that night. Tommy, sitting up in his bed and looking stronger each day, spoke up. When I grow up, he declared, I want to help people too, like all of you do. The room filled with laughter and happy tears as they realized that the circle of kindness would continue through the next generation. What had started as a desperate rescue on a stormy night had grown into something much larger, a demonstration of how one act of bravery could echo through decades, connecting lives and creating miracles. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Michael looked at the twins who were once tiny babies in his arms, now successful adults who had helped save his grandson. He thought about the mysterious ways life works, how sometimes the greatest rewards come years after our bravest moments, and how love and courage can span generations. The story of the firefighter and the twins would be told for years to come, reminding people that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear firefighter gear, doctor's coats, or carry architectural blueprints. But most importantly, it showed that when it comes to saving lives, the circle never really ends. It just takes new forms as it touches more hearts along the way.